Hey everyone, Rarity Dash here. Time for another Patreon-sponsored Blind Reaction. And this one comes to you courtesy of Josiah the Game King, who has requested that I react to Edward VIII, the man who would be king by myth of the 20th century. And this is a longer video, so I'll only be watching the first part, like the first 45 minutes of it. If the patron likes the reaction, though, then maybe they'll request the rest later. I don't know. Up to them. But yeah, Edward VIII. So we're talking history today, I guess. And I don't really know much about Edward VIII. I think that's, is that the one who was only king for like a really short amount of time? Like less than a year? I think it might be. And then he like abdicated the throne. I don't know. Don't really know my British monarchs, but I think that might be the one. I guess we'll find out soon enough. Not really sure what to expect from this, but hopefully it'll be good. Hopefully it'll be informative. Let's get started and find out. Here we go.
Edward VIII, King of England and Germanophile, was forced to abdicate on December 11th, 1936.
There we go.
He died in Paris, France, at age 77 in 1972, with his wife, Wallis Simpson, and no children. The reasons for his abdication are disputed, but the two most common are his involvement with the divorcee and American Simpson, and his admiration for the German system and its economic revival under Adolf Hitler.
Okay, well that would probably do it.
He sought to make peace between Britain and Germany, but to the war and financial powers that ruled, he was a threat to their desire to finish the Germans once and for all.
Well, I'm not a crook. I burned everything.
Nixon.
Military-industrial complex.
Eisenhower.
A new world order. But we are here to destroy
Bush.
the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
Reagan, Clinton, just all the presidents.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. I'm
It's a
Hans
podcast.
Albert, and today we are joined by Mr. Nick Mason
Hey.
and Mr. Adam Smith.
Hey, don't forget
Also
our
joined-
wonderful guest.
Yeah, we're also joined by our special guest, Fulwar.
How's it going, everybody?
Today, I think we're going to talk about a certain royal family member who may have committed wrongthink, may have had a few affairs, and held the fate of World War II in his hands at one point in time. Of course, we're talking about King Edward VIII. King Edward VIII, as some might know from sort of popular culture, was the infamous Nazi collaborator king in early World War II. A member of the House of Windsor, which is really the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which is really just the House of Hanover. This man was basically a German who was sitting on the throne of England and decided in his soon-to-be enunciation to kingship that he would support the regime in Hitler's Third Reich, and that he would enact the policy of neutrality at one point in the war. But there's a lot of popular myths about this man. I think he's been portrayed recently on a show called The Queen. Never watched it, but my understanding is that he's portrayed very harshly and improperly. And furthermore, I think he's been portrayed in a very, very stupid Harvey Weinstein movie called The King's Speech. Also portrayed
Never saw
as
that.
like a sniveling weakling and a socialite more than a king.
And one also in The Darkest Hour. You know, this is well, yeah, because I actually just watched that one recently. But it was when I was watching, because I watch almost no television, but my girlfriend does. And like one day or whatever, she was trying, because whenever she watches television, I basically, turn into like the old dudes in the Muppets.
Well, this might be a little dry.
I'm just like, wah, wah, wah,
I don't know.
at all the degeneracy or whatever. And so she decided she was going to sneak me one time. And like I was reading a book or whatever, and I looked up, and there was, they're talking about the House of Windsor, and it was this show, and it's actually really good in a lot of ways, but it's sort of like there's two shows that the Brits are running right now that I think are very good, but they occasionally jeopardize this sort of firewall, this sort of multicultural firewall that the Brits had put up. And I sort of feel bad being an American and commenting on the Brits like this, but like the way these particular representations of Edward, because they like the show the show about that's currently running, they mostly stick to the correct line or whatever, but there is a scene where you see you see Edward VIII, and he's in his quintessential, and we'll talk about this as well. Well, this is one of his
kind of taking a while to get to the point here.
Is one of the reasons why he was so popular at the time. He was, if you think of the who is it? It's not Eliot. The Ezra Pound line, the age demanded an image. And Edward VIII is really one of these guys. He was the image of his particular epoch in Europe.
He strikes me as the Jude Law character in The Talented Mr. Ripley. He's sort of like this kind of double-breasted, vacationing in the Azures or wherever, and very handsome guy. Not necessarily super bookish, but. Or frankly, a good speaker if you've heard his voice, but he looked the part. He looked the part is my point.
Well, as I say, he was short, and actually the magazines at the time frequently referred to him as hideous.
Oh,
like if you, but I don't
ridiculous.
see it. I don't see it because
is that him?
The entire House of Hanover is
see it either.
And so like telling the difference between the hideousness of one of them and hideousness of the other. This is like if you look at a picture of like Queen Victoria, she's hideous. And like all of her grandkids and everybody, they all look like her. And so like you even see it in Wilhelm I or whatever. But like they'll say he was short. He wasn't just a particularly handsome man. Though I could now I'm looking at a picture of him right now, and I'm thinking when he was younger he kind of looked like an elf. But he aged extraordinarily well. But like this is one of these things that he
just looks normal there.
He dressed extraordinarily well, and he dressed in such a famous way that like I actually just bought one recently. There's a suit named after him. It's the classic Prince of Wales suit. And this is the one it's the gray check suit that you see James Bond wearing, where you see Sean Connery. I think every iteration of James Bond has done a Prince of Wales suit before. So he's a guy who like even though he's shuffled off into the darkness, in a lot of ways, he was an incredibly influential figure, especially in the middle section of the 20th century. And this is a portion of time when being an influential person meant you had a short shelf life, and like you could say one thing and enter history forever in either the good or bad way. And sort of the way it shook out with him is that he made a decision and has been vilified for it ever since. And because the modern press machine, the modern press cabal existed more or less in the same form it does today. He basically got he basically got attacked in memory hold very quickly, and like one of the things we'll talk about is this abdication crisis happened very quickly, and he was a very young man at the time. Well, he wasn't a young man; he was in his 40s, which is at the time that's still considered relatively young.
Yeah.
But it all happened to him very quickly, and then there was almost a pre-canned myth that they had ready to go for this particular instance, and he's sort of been shuffled off, and not many people know about it now. Like, the only people who like really talk about Edward VIII at this point are like dandies in King's Cross Station.
No, that's exactly right. I actually didn't know much about him, and I wasn't sure if the King's Speech was in reference to him, but what I remember about that film, not having seen it, was that it was portraying this
what I remember not having seen it,
that was sort of insignificant, and he was attempting to sort of make himself more than he was. That was the intent of the movie, from what I gathered. And after doing a little research on this, he was king for no more than less than a year, I believe. Is that right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Whenever I was talking to somebody about doing the show, and I don't want to say the name of the show or anything. A lot of my friends know I come on podcasts, and they just think that's sort of mysterious. But I'm doing a show on Edward VIII, and they asked who Edward VIII was, and I said, well, I was like, he was king for about as long as the show is gonna take to record. But but it's not a particularly glamorous reign either or anything like that. It's more because it fits into this if you imagine sort of like,
this guy's not exactly great to listen to.
1936 to 1939 as like a closed thermodynamic system. This is when a lot of energy is being
I guess he seems to know his stuff, but
thermodynamic system, and he's sort of a man who stands, if you think of these people who stand, with their one leg straddled on either side of time, screaming "stop." He's one of these people who possibly could have made it stop, and he could have changed the course of the 20th century. But since it would have been, it would be altering the teleological, the progressive, or even the Whig history that the Anglo-American world is very invested in propping up right now. That he's somebody who is absolutely reviled. And whenever I was doing preliminary research for this topic, I ran across. I was because I was in JSTOR going through it, and one of the articles I was reading said, this is one of the most examined topics in the history of the 20th century.
No, it's not.
Well, it is, and this is like one of these things
maybe
where,
by
like,
historians,
people using JSTOR.
In this sort of like closed loop world of professional scholarship and everything.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it's also kind of a story that could only have happened in the 20th century, because there have been plenty of books that sort of tell this side of the story but they're going to be books that are not published by mainstream publishers. They're not big six publishers or anything like that. Some of them are written by Oxford Dons, and they just got memory hold because they didn't like, every time somebody writes a book telling this side of the story, there will be 5 books published that are backing up the official narrative that get like glowing New York Times reviews, or somebody, because nobody reads anymore, they'll make a movie like The King's Speech, which is one of the most retconned examples of Whig. Like, if you think of the myth of Winston Churchill, which is not unrelated here, though ironically Winston Churchill was a supporter of Edward VIII. This is just one of these things where the British have sort of, they don't, because they like to present themselves as like free speech advocates and everything. They don't do things.
So gotta love that X-Lax ad in the corner there.
A picture of Edward VIII in your apartment or something like that. They're just going to provide a lot of like tacitly state-sponsored information.
Kind of funny.
Can be used to debunk your wild conspiracy theory.
It's like in America.
It's always interesting to see an old
let's
newspaper.
be specific about what happened. So he was king, and he was expressing pro-German sympathies.
Well, it goes deeper than that. This man is effectively German.
Well,
he spoke German. He was sort of a Germanophile. His family had significant ties within Germany. I believe that both the Duke of Hesse, and also the Prince of Coburg-Saxe-Gotha and other regions of Germany were close cousins. And the House of Hanover also had connections in Denmark. It had connections within Belgium, had connections within Portugal, and of course the Kaiser Wilhelm, the Kaiser who oversaw sort of the failure of Germany in World War I was a cousin of this family. So was the Romanov family in Russia. So this man was part of a large Germanic family network that had ascended to various thrones and positions of power throughout Europe, mostly royal, some civil, some military, and had maintained this level of Germanophiliism within their own family network. So it wasn't beyond the pale to assume that this man would find some common cause in trying to understand his German cousins.
I agree, but it begs the question why the rest of his family didn't support him, if they're all Germans.
Well, the thing is that I think that his family would have fallen in line had it not been for this mistress that he was carrying around with him. He also had a penchant for sleeping around. Anyways, he had very unroyal behavior within London. He was
so he kind of dug his own hole here, then.
Artistic, but also free social circles in London. This put a stain on the family's image, and I think had he been much more resolute like his father, he would probably have been able to enact much more support within his family and within England for at least staying out of the war.
Well, let me ask you, what is unroyal behavior? In a monarchy whose claim to legendary fame is that they told the Pope, no, I'm gonna get a divorce. I'm gonna go do this thing. Or what is unroyal behavior? If you are a monarchist,
something that looks bad in the press is what it comes down to.
If you are a monarchist, this is a man who was ordained by God. And to intervene into this relationship is, I have actually said, and because I'm a Southerner, and so I have a tendency to dwell on dark aspects of history and of my own history and everything like that. And and as somebody who is genetically and even culturally in many ways still part of the Anglo remnant or the founding stock of America. This is one of these things where I sort of look at this situation and say, this is one of these examples that sort of makes the English people look like we're under something like a curse of Gilead, or we've broken some sort of awful covenant. Because if you look at our history, we've cut one king's head off, we've revolted against another, and then the cousins back on the other side of the pond intervene here, and they force a person who was rightfully next in line to the throne to abdicate over what has been totally retconned as this, maybe not totally retconned, but there is, if you look at this Wallace Simpson bit, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, first of all, that Wallace Simpson had some connections in America with people who would later, they're Jews, they're bankers, they're a lot of the same people who are also going to be involved in getting America involved in World War II. Now, it's not to say that this was all a plant or anything like that, because the greatest conspiracies in world history have a lot of organic elements to them. But this is possibly one of the greatest coups that was ever pulled off in plain sight in front of everyone, without a shot being fired, or hardly even a headline being out of place. But to go back and talk about that Germanness or whatever, this is one of these things where in the Royals, or in the current Netflix series, one of the things is this, it's he refers to his he hates his family. This is all in the 1960s or whatever, but he has some just terrible things to say about his family, and his family has turned very Machiavellian at this point. This is this is not the family. This is not the Black Prince. This is not Henry V. This is not the Plantagenet family. They're not warrior kings or anything like that. They're an incredibly reduced monarchy that managed to survive World War I. And if you actually look at there's a great book about before World War I happens by Barbara Tuchman. It's the same woman that wrote The Guns of August, called The Proud Tower.
Oh, The Proud Tower. That's a great book. Yeah.
And the first line in The Proud Tower is something to the effect of the last government in the West that had all the trappings of an effective aristocracy took office in the United Kingdom in 1895, when Lord Salisbury was the last prime minister to come out of the House of Lords. So like moving forward, this is right around the turn of the century, right? This is right around the time of the sudden appearance of the American peril on the Western horizon, and the monarchies of Europe are arguably at their strongest in 1900, and then in 1914, this family, which is what they were. They're almost all of the major players in World War I are grandchildren, or their official heads of state. Wilhelm I had by far the most, and Wilhelm I and who's the one in Russia? Nicholas II. Yeah. Yes. Nicholas II had by far. What
was the?
Now we got audio issues.
All the various interrelated monarchs of Europe.
It was the funeral of, I think it was George. It was either George or an Edward, but I know exactly what picture and what line you're talking about. Just like the splendor, the sun was setting on the old world, and I post it occasionally, and every time I read it, I start crying. There's a famous picture where I think it's nine European monarchs all in one picture, in all of their in their and I would love to see a colorized version of this picture, and I've never seen one before, just to see what it looked like, because one of these things is
that not in color?
When you look at pictures of this era and they've actually been colorized, there's a lot more pop. Like you have friends like F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is an American, and he's a famous snazzy dresser and everything. But if you look at pictures of him now, you just see it just looks like gray and white. But if it's colorized, you realize these people were wearing like yellow and orange suits and stuff like that. It's pretty wild. I would like to see that.
Well, in that spirit, Nick, you were recommending that movie "They Will Not Grow Old," right? That colorized World War I.
Yeah, I can recommend. Yes, it's pretty remarkable.
I cried all the way through that one. Quick sidebar on that. Peter Jackson has been doing World War I related stuff for almost 10 years now.
Has he?
I remember the first time I saw one. It was about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was like, because he's the CGI guy. Mm-hmm. Like he got really famous for like the CGI that he did with Lord of the Rings, because it was groundbreaking stuff at the time. So he's always been a guy who like piddled around with that stuff. But about 10 years ago, he started like messing with like recreations of World War I stuff and everything. But it was never like part of an official project that was announced or anything. You should watch the documentary where he explains just how much work went into restoring this footage.
Yeah, he was a collector his entire life, and in that film he uses, and he had some regrets about using it, but he thought it was the best he could do. Was he used some British war propaganda magazines, and those were all from his personal collection.
Well, this is like they because they don't have, and this is I think one of the reasons it came out so well is they didn't use like an algorithm or anything like that to like speed up and slow down. And a lot of times what they're doing is they're inserting artificial frames between.
Yeah, because they had to bring the frame rate up.
Right, but they just did it organically, and so they just basically went frame by frame to make sure it doesn't look herky jerky or anything like that. And then whenever they were like they got forensic voice lip readers to come in and like try to figure out what these dudes were saying in the film section that they were showing, and then they looked at the uniforms, and they went and got voice actors from like parts of Britain and Germany that the people that were talking were from, and they got them to come in and do it like with the like local dialects and everything. It's painstaking.
And those they used for the firsthand reading the memoirs and firsthand narrations. Those they got the people from, because the BBC had conducted a lot of interviews.
Oh yeah, no.
World War I vets in the early 1970s.
The only thing about it that sort of bothers me is I think they sort of played up the camaraderie between the average German and the average Brit. I'm sort of leery about that. But in the case of the royals, this is very much, and especially not so much, and not even just the royals. In the case of the British ruling class writ large, these are going to be people who, in 1910, they're a good deal more culturally associated with Germany than they are with even France. Like
I had a question. For what you said earlier about royal behavior, I was curious how the behavior of having 6 wives, executing
someone's smoke detector going off there.
Well, right. I mean, it's a scandal, but like one of the and as you eventually get here, one of the there's in the sort of dramatis personae that sort of appear here. There's Edward VIII. There's the woman. There's the dorky brother who is it's what they called him, Bertie. Sometimes I call him the retard king.
Okay.
But he's very good friends, and Bertie is very good friends with this dude who is going to be Winston Churchill's competition for prime minister, and it was the Viscount Halifax. There's a lot of swirling. There's just the swirling layers here are absolutely incredible. But like, okay, if Edward's behavior is unroyal, what about a king who can't even speak? What about a king who's he says over and over and over that he doesn't want this job. What he wants to do is go back to his castle in Balmoral, and he wants to drink. He was a chain smoker. This is what eventually kills him, is because deep vein thrombosis or whatever. He's just not a very healthy person. He's not a very cultured person. He's a family man. He's a good family man. I won't take that from him or anything like that. But he has virtually no interest in politics or the monarchy or anything like that. And there's a lot of reasons why this ends up making him more attractive as a king than Edward VIII was. And it all goes back. And like I'm one of these people who I don't believe that World War II and World War I can be functionally separated from one another. I'm like on this
they are
sort of new paradigm. It's not a new paradigm by any means, but it's
pretty closely related.
Sort of bringing it back. You call it the Second 30 Years' War.
Well, someone described it as basically a war that was separated by like a 20-year break. I mean, I can't remember who that was, but I mean that's an idea that I've heard before.
But if you look at and this is one of the incidents that makes it seem like, well, how much of a break was it? Like, does the political maneuvering between these major players ever really stop? There's a faction headed by, ironically, Winston Churchill, he's a player that just pops in and out of this game, who they're going to go to war with Germany virtually at all costs. And Edward, the reason when I believe that Winston Churchill ends up falling on the side, and this hurts him politically as well, because whenever he eventually does get the nod for prime minister, he has to go in and take because the way the British government is, the king has to request a new prime minister to form a government. And he has to take this request from a king who he's been aligned against for most of the last 10 years or so. But Winston Churchill, of course, was American. Well, he's half American. And so this, you know,
Was he?
this idea of, and he's
Never knew that.
very about this sort of Anglo-American sort of union and everything like that, having a English king who was married to an American divorcee is not, you know, it's not something. It plays into his narrative. It plays into one of his narratives and it plays out of one of his other narratives. It plays into his Anglo-American narrative and it plays out of his war against Hitler narrative. And so there's a lot of moving pieces and everything, but like the root of this is, and it's just but like before we just run off on too many tangents, we just have to go back. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to add, it's ironic that, I mean, she was denounced as an American whore, and now in the current year you have the African.
Oh no, it absolutely is, and this abdication moment is in a lot of ways it's an accelerant to the degeneration of this particular monarchical structure, and this is another one of these things that makes this official narrative seem kind of iffy. Because if there is no way to look at this situation. For instance, I don't know, somebody told me recently, and Lord, I'm going to go to hell for this, but there, you know, she will be known as Elizabeth the Worst whenever she finally dies. She has presided over the destruction of the most glamorous empire that has ever existed in the history of the world, and she has steadfastly surrendered the last vestiges of aristocratic power in the United Kingdom, culminating finally in really the 1999 House of Lords Act, which functionally barred the actual real aristocracy from even sitting in the House of Lords. And so whenever Edward becomes king, you're looking at a wounded aristocracy, but you're looking at a royal. This is a touch and go moment in British history where there is this because the king is still a highly revered figure who still has some trappings of his power. The relationship between the king and secular government is really starting to get sort of entwined and everything. And it's just sort of like, so now the press, the mechanisms of modern politics can step into this equation and functionally dethrone a king. But they did it really fast because they weren't sure that it could have. They weren't sure the effect this was going to have. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to get away with it at the time. So it's a daring coup. And they pulled it off, and like as with all daring coups, it's been erased by the victors. But
let's go through how that happened.
I wanted to ask was specifically about the machinations of Stanley Baldwin.
Well, Stanley,
like Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop.
Yeah, these are. Whenever I was talking about the dramatis personae there. Cosmo Gordon Lang is the one, is the missing figure in the mainstream narrative. And I don't know that he is, to me, he's sort of a guy. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's 30 years older and ironically, he has a lot of personal tastes that are similar to Edward VIII. Maybe not politically, but personally. He's also one of these sort of pseudo-fashion figures. He believes rheumatically almost in an arthritic fashion in the mystical power of the British monarchy and in the ritual of the British monarchy, and he perceives Wallace Simpson as a threat to the viability of the British monarchy. And there's also some things is that Edward VIII was going to make some changes to the coronation ceremony our Archbishop Lang, he's only recently become the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and he, if you're the Archbishop of Canterbury presiding over the coronation of a king, is like that is your moment to shine back in this day or whatever, and he wasn't going to have anything different that had been different from Victoria's reign, because this is he's one of these older gentlemen who recalls this almost stodgy splendor that the British Empire had recognized at this point, and he doesn't want to change a damn thing. And so he begins sort of actively working against Edward VIII, originally, but I don't think that he on his own likely would never have been able to pull off this kind of coup. In order to do it, he goes to a group of people, and this is like sort of the way the Wallace Simpson thing broke is it's sort of murky. Because this is a time when actually probably people wouldn't have known about it, but the relationship between the press in Britain then and the government of Britain then is probably cozier than it is now, because they still have all these club systems intact where the major executives have made enough money that they've sort of infiltrated these this club system where all of these old English families congregate, where they sort of they eat and they play cards, they talk about everything. And so in England at this time, even possibly more so than it is today, the press was functionally an appendage of the secular state, not so much the crown. But what sort of happens is that Cosmo, when the first whisperings of this Wallace Simpson incident start creeping through the British and the layers of the British intelligentsia and everything like that, there's a sort of gentleman's agreement between the press and the government that whenever they are going to publish something that is going to be absolutely an absolute PR disaster, they warn government officials, not through official channels or anything like that, but just through conversations at dinner and stuff like that. This is all going to be stuff that doesn't leave any kind of paper record. And so when this Wallace Simpson, whenever it becomes clear that and he was doing this without the knowledge of his own father. He was doing this without the knowledge of his family or anything like that, because the royal family it's not a normal family. They don't they have peerage functions together and everything like that. But I mean, there's some enmity between the father and the son in this case. There's some tensions in the family, and they're frequently apart. So it's super easy to pull one over on dad. But when it becomes apparent that he's shacked up with this Wallace Simpson, who is still married to an American businessman. She hasn't yet divorced him, and she's divorced her last husband as well. The British press decides this is going to be a scandal, and so they start warning people through the grapevine. And Cosmo Lang, this guy who is absolutely unhappy with a lot of the things that Edward has been doing or has planned, and because this is he's entirely unhappy with it or whatever. So there's a meeting, and like I said, I'm bad with dates, and I've changed the window and I can't pull it up. But there's a meeting between these British press officials, Cosmo Gordon Lang, and either Stanley Baldwin or someone who represented Stanley Baldwin. It's sort of murky exactly what they discussed or whatever, but they came away from this meeting, and Cosmo Lang is victorious. They have decided that the king has to go, and so from there's a plan. A plan is sort of hatched to leak this Wallace Simpson story, kind of the way the modern press is going to. They try to create a feeding frenzy, and so they drop a story, and you just let it sit for a day or something like that. The first one doesn't make any waves, but eventually, the second and third one or whatever, and as these stories begin to drop, people start arriving to speak with the king, and they tell him this is going to get worse, this is going to get worse, this is going to get worse. He's only been king, he's been prepared for this role considerably better than his younger brother was. But this isn't running a medieval state where you have like 2,000 or 3,000 people who in your immediate vicinity who matter. This is a global empire that's run from London, and mass culture and mass politics are in full sway, and so they can really create. I mean, it can if this narrative turns south on him, it could really create a firestorm. And on the other hand, the Gordon Lang, Stanley Baldwin, the anti-king faction is very concerned because at the same time, Edward VIII is an incredibly popular person. And initially, when these stories start to drop, the public doesn't seem to really care one way or the other what the king does.
Makes sense.
This is probably to insert my editorial. If you imagine this is a relationship between the king and God, who are we to intervene? Who are we to decide who the king marries?
Well, the story that they fixated on was completely fabricated after people examined this later on, but at the time, I mean, it was so salacious that it seemed to have its effect on the cabinet, the prime minister in particular, or at least he saw it as sort of an effective tool politically to seek out what he wanted, which is basically the removal of this king. And the story was that this woman that Edward was in love with was had a sexual history of frequenting brothels in Shanghai and learning the seductive techniques of Chinese prostitutes.
Okay.
That was what they fabricated, and that was what I understood to be the tip of the spear of what their thrust against him was.
What's wrong with that?
The funny thing about this, if you fast forward to 2019. This narrative would be totally inverted. Like learning tricks from Chinese whores would be like, you're wow, multicultural and tolerant, and it would be the person who is sort of a staunch defender of traditional marriage that gets vilified.
The scandal would be if she was a virgin.
Yeah, exactly. But how the king gets hooked up with Wallace Simpson is one, and how he becomes, because like I said, it takes a couple of days for him to whip up the firestorm they were trying to whip up. The thing is, you have to sort of go back to World War I and look at this, because during World War I, Edward's father had been, I think this is King George V. He had been relatively quiet during World War I itself for a lot of predictable reasons, because he doesn't want to show, even though even internally, Wilhelm I was he was the loony cousin of the between all of the grandchildren of Victoria, and he's also probably the one that wields the most power. Nicholas II is ruling as an absolute monarch, but Russia is just such a big, sprawling country. It's very difficult for there are aristocratic factions and large landholding factions that operate as checks on his power. But Wilhelm really runs the show in Germany. Much to its detriment in a lot of ways. I think it was Dan Carlin that said, on the role of aristocratic, or the role of king dice. If Wilhelm I wasn't like Snake Eyes, but he would have been like a 3 out of possible 12. He's not just a great, and Nicholas was as well, and also probably George V was as well. These are not brilliant people by any means, but George V was one of these guys who was careful enough. He knew to keep quiet, because it was very apparent that all of these European monarchies were crumbling, and the British one is the only one. The Habsburgs disappear entirely. the House of Hohenzollern, which is the ruling class in Prussia. They still hold the titular title in Romania, I think, but that's a cadet branch. And there is still a House of Hohenzollern, but it doesn't even have any ceremonial power. The British aristocracy is the only one of these that really escapes, and it's the only one that remains intact, and it does so largely because of the Windsors willing to scuttle their own family to keep this sort of power. And this is all stuff that's sort of going on behind the scenes. We know, for instance, that there was a plan to evacuate Nicholas II to England at the end of World War II, and it just never happened because the British king was, he prevaricates on this. For months he prevaricates, like the Tsar is packed and ready to go, and it's like, yeah, no, just wait, just wait, and then it's like, no, all of a sudden this won't happen, and then they tried a last minute. He had last minute regrets, and they tried to send a team in to find the Tsar, and they couldn't find him. But during World War I, and this is where Edward becomes very influential with the British people, if not with the British intelligentsia. He's the most visible member as Prince of Wales. He's the most visible member of the royal family.
Okay. Now that's my cutoff point. Yeah. Well, that was pretty tedious. I don't know. I just not good entertainment. I mean, the guys seem knowledgeable, but that doesn't translate to entertaining. I mean, the main guy, he was not really that articulate. He seemed like to have trouble stringing his sentence together, and just a lot of stuttering. It wasn't really, because I'm actually kind of interested in this sort of stuff. I like history. I like, I'm not really knowledgeable of it as said, but I do like hearing about it, and like historical conspiracies and just the role of media and things that can be pretty fascinating to me. But just a long form podcast of not really interesting people talking about it is not really how you keep my attention. I'm sure there's an interesting story in here. It kind of sounds like there is, but just this this was pretty dull. When you talk about these things, it's probably better to punch it up, make a shorter form thing. I mean, I know I like podcasts sometimes, just a discussion, but there's a difference between like a really scintillating podcast discussion and this. Just didn't really do it for me. But anyway, I hope you liked the reaction. Let me know if you did, and see you in the next one.